Hello and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our virtual roundtable on insights into the UAE.
What's so interesting about the UAE is that there's a very clear template or clear guide for businesses and brands to establish themselves and to introduce themselves locally across the entire nation or across the multiple emirates. So some of the key themes that are very interesting are sustainability, mobility, and opportunity. So while the world's economy was moving towards globalization, the region was still struggling to be part of that. And looking at the past 10 years, there have been quite remarkable advancements when we look at mobility. At the same time, we're looking at sustainability. Sustainability is a word that we've heard quite a lot from multiple perspectives, looking at the environment mainly, but then also looking at human capital, investment in human capital, and recently we're looking at more sustainable business practices. So looking at National Agenda 21, we can see sustainability again, and we can look at smart services and smart city. So today, integrating a smart initiative into any brand or any business is a key economic driver towards success. And we always have to focus on where the federal budget is going to. So for instance, if we look at the prosperity, we're looking at a 4% compounded annual growth rate for the non-oil GDP, which is remarkable because the country has time and time again has focused on shifting away from oil revenues and focusing deeply on diversifying revenue, which is another sustainable practice that we're looking at in the region. So the key theme for economic recovery, for economic prosperity is ESG. So just to run through some basic figures, we're looking at the triple bottom lines: people, planet, prosperity. We've reached a population of 9.5 million. In terms of inclusion, we're looking at more than 200 nationalities across the UAE, and that inclusion also spreads to economic inclusion. Again, we look at expat population, 88.5%. I think that says a lot about the inclusion. Age bracket majority is 25 to 54. Very interesting, because it just shows you how young the population is, how able it is in terms of seeking long-term targets. One of the main things that is still a bit disappointing, but it's a reflection of the labor market, it's the 72% male domination of the population. And that's just basically relevant to the construction sector, which is widely popular across the UAE and is one of the main drivers following oil revenue.
Traditional media continues to shrink. And I know this is a thing globally, but in the region, it's very, very true. There have been, I would say, thousands of jobs lost over the last few years, much fewer journalists. It's obviously been a difficult time for advertising, and it definitely affects a lot of things. What is happening with media is that they're seeing the media owners are seeing social media as one of their channels. For example, I think it's Sayadati, which is an Arabic lifestyle magazine, actually earns more from its TikTok channel in terms of advertising than it did from its in-book advertising channels, which is incredible. So social media took off massively last year. This is no surprise to anybody, of course, but here in the region, fueled by e-commerce, which has been a major success, and fueled by video. Any of you who've looked in kind of regional media analysis will see that YouTube is massive, particularly in Saudi Arabia, but here as well. As an adjunct to kind of modern media. TikTok has really exploded, and actually, if you speak to agency heads, they all think that TikTok's targeting them, has got it in for them. And actually, if you speak to Sami Moutron, who runs TikTok in the region, he thinks every agency thinks he's picking on him, but he's not. The fact is, they've just exploded. And obviously, these social channels influenced by a massive youth demographic in the region. What you are seeing is, people's expectation of digital media is good content, whether it comes from brands or people. And you're seeing increasingly that organizations here, particularly the more sophisticated ones, are thinking like their own publishers, whether it's creating, branded content, whether it's creating film, whether it's creating, their own channels. There are some very sophisticated operators in here, and some of them set up their own TV and film studios, their own multimedia studios. So they kind of realize that, you know, there's a lot of entertainment, a lot of need for informative, useful content. If they can create it, bada bing, they'll get some engagement.
In UAE, we are looking at about 9.5 million population and a very diverse population here as well. We have 11.5% as the UAE nationals or the local share. Rest of it, 89% is all expatriates. An important point from consumer perspective is a very strong mall culture that exists in UAE. Malls are pretty much malls, and I mean, going out for shopping is pretty much part of the social grain of UAE. I mean, malls are a place to socialize. They are a place to go out and eat, and importantly, to shop. What you see is, because of this, and I mean, some of this stats is slightly dated today, and particularly with whatever has happened in 2020. But if you look at the density of malls in UAE, and this is, I mean, there is a matrix around square meters of GLA per 1,000 people or population, you would find that Dubai and Abu Dhabi really rank quite high compared to the other global cities. So you're kind of looking at, in Dubai, in case of Dubai, you're looking at 1 square meter of mall space for every individual in Dubai. So that's how high the mall density is. Within that, the average consumer in UAE is very, very tech savvy. And this is some of the understanding that we have, and we've pulled from other sources. So some of the work that we have done in the past, we've seen a very high penetration for food apps, for instance, amongst the UAE consumers. Likewise, I think MasterCard came up with some stats on the UAE market, where they saw 84% of the consumers in UAE have started using contactless payments. So moving away from cash, moving away from cards, and going completely contactless. I'm sure, I mean, some of this trend is also seen in other markets, but UAE is definitely moving in that direction.
The UAE is this really beautiful mosaic of culture. The country is really welcoming to this diverse array of people and cultures, as a lot of the experts have already mentioned, and everyone brings their own uniqueness and individuality to the country. Everyone who lives here is still very much defined by their own unique point of view and their connection to their own roots and to their own heritage. So then the question that we have to ask is then, how do brands talk to such a diverse group of people, from local Emiratis, expat Arabs from the Levant or GCC, expat Asians, expat Europeans, all that live here in this country? So far, the focus of a lot of the global brands has been to bring their own global positioning to the region and Arabize it, specifically for the Arabs. And then they keep it the same for those who speak English. And of course, with that Arab-looking cast, essentially grouping the country into two things, Arabic speaking and English speaking. This then creates brand communication that is quite disconnected to people in the UAE, and it doesn't hold any significant meaning, because they try to talk to absolutely everyone in the country, but actually that does the complete opposite of what they intend, because it lacks the details that are important for the audiences here. Brands and agencies need to embrace and own the diversity of the country. So knowing that your communication will not necessarily attract every single person living in the UAE is important. Your communication and your brand cannot be a one-size-fits-all. That's the first thing that we need to embrace. Secondly, realizing that in the UAE, there are several clusters of cultures that are defined by people's roots, their heritage, personal values, struggles, and so much more. That's really important. And that could make things a lot more exciting for communication, a lot more exciting for brands as well, because it allows us to find unique common threads between groups of people that we otherwise would have kept isolated from one another. Thirdly, brands have to really make a choice. Like it comes down to just deciding on what's important. See which clusters of cultures match or could potentially match with your own brand, and start your narrative there. That's where your brand story can begin and actually flourish.
we have to start moving away from demographics. They're definitely something that play a role in terms of how people behave or react or respond to your communication. But the big thing that I believe every brand, that especially any brand that's entering the UAE, needs to do is do a very deep analysis of what the high value audiences for you and your brand are. So, for example, no matter what your industry is, what is my current, for the industry, the current core consumer audiences, and what are the audiences that are going to become the foundation stone for my growth or the growth of my brand. Traditional media, number one, we have channels that cater to different ethnicities, and it's very easy to just divide content basis that and go to the traditional media. But then as you enter the digital landscape, that is where you have the option and you have the opportunity to then create multiple content pieces catered to the high value audiences that you have identified in the first step of your research of what the UAE audience is, and then test them and utilize all the tools and all the media outlets available to you to make sure that you're serving content, that you're speaking to your audiences in a manner, in the language, with the context, with the analogies that work with them. Where we saw that the population is predominantly male, almost 72%. All the recent researches show that women are behind almost 80% of the purchase decisions. So in a lot of cases, they are the buyers or the decision makers. So understanding the female UA audience is an investment that you are not going to regret. You absolutely need to deep dive.
Generation Z, I think everywhere, are so opinionated, they're so excited, they want a brand that is meaningful, that connects to their own values. And I think that UAE has a bunch of Generation Z that are more than that than any other place. I think they're really excited, they really want to be activists, and their brands have to stand for the same values. And the communication that they like also has to have that. It has to connect to them on that meaningful level, as I was explaining in my introduction, that they're looking for meaning, they're looking for something to connect, and they want to buy into brands that, again, kind of connect with their own values.
There's a great resemblance between individuals and consumers and the businesses. So today, when we use terminology such as values, from a business perspective, ESG resembles those values in a way. And so we can see how they're the same drivers of consumerism and of how businesses make profits and how businesses establish themselves among consumers.
The UAE's COVID response, for those who in the audience who weren't in the region, I think was, having observed globally, one of the fastest and most decisive. And I think, they were very early in getting vaccine programs in place. And I think one of the first countries to offer as much choice in vaccinations. And I think that has contributed. I think that speed, and obviously we live in a society where people broadly follow the rules, and when they're told to lock down and when they're told not to do something, they do it, which is in stark contrast to the scenes that you might have seen in the US or in some parts of Europe. And I think as a result, we have very low infection rates, we have very high inoculation rates. I think as a result of that, I think you've got a country that is quite confident in what the future looks like. I mean, this has always been a center of commerce, right? I think most of us are probably in Dubai. There may be some of us in Abu Dhabi as well. This is always a place where things happen. I think Issam mentioned it's a place of opportunity. This is a place of opportunity, and it's a beacon of opportunity, a lighthouse if you are in this region, because if you're coming from, parts of, some of the more troubled parts of the Middle East, or if you're coming from, India, which is, our nearest neighbor next door, or if you're coming from Southeast Asia or Africa, this is a place where you can come and seize an opportunity. And that message, I don't think, has changed at all.
Now is the time to be very optimistic, as she exactly said. At the beginning of it, you could see that a lot of brands were communicating in a very kind of way that instilled a lot of anxiety, and people already had a lot of anxiety around what was happening. So that made people just more fearful, and it wasn't giving people that good feeling that they needed. So anytime that we were creating a brand strategy around communication with COVID-19, we had to make sure that we had a very clear consumer journey and understanding of how we were going to go through the different phases. And our phases were no longer, awareness and all of that. It was actually now, okay, at the beginning of our communication, maybe we can instill a little bit of an anxiety, a little bit of fear to make people do what's necessary to be safe, to make sure that they're not close to each other, etc. At the second stage, you need to calm down the anxiety, make sure that people are a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more understanding of the situation, that it's not the end of the world. And then the third stage is actually to bring back that excitement of the new world, the new changes, and to live in this new world that we have, and no longer kind of using that anxiety and that stress that we were doing at the beginning two phases, for example. So that's how the communication, that's where we are now with communication in COVID-19, that you should be a lot more optimistic. You should have that essence of, okay, just be safe, but we shouldn't be honing down on that anxiety and fear anymore. People don't want to feel that anymore.
The way we see this, at least how things are transpiring now. So with 2020 and with the lockdown, a lot of malls were shut down, outlets were shut down, which meant retailers had to recalibrate and move online. A lot of them did that, wonderfully well. In a span of few weeks, they were able to sort of move the channel online. A lot of consumers moved online with that, and some of them will continue to stay, online in the future as well. But that said, I think mall still continues to be, part of the social grain, as I had mentioned earlier. I see that to be, a sort of a coexistence for malls as well as online. And I think retailers particularly will need to really, strike that right balance between offline presence and online, and, being able to offer a more seamless experience to their consumers as they do that.
So I think it's a super interesting situation here in the UAE, where e-com sort of became a necessity, and we know that the credit card penetration is really high, mobile penetration is really high, but culturally, going to the store, going to the supermarket is a big family event. And I think that is, if specifically for anybody who is in the FMCG sort of a network, or the associated to the FMCG industry, understanding the shopper behavior, the importance of the store, and the importance of the deals and the deal cycle is very important. And that's absolutely a part of the consumer behavior here.
I think what also drives consumer behavior is also the spending on infrastructure. So how much businesses spend on the different omni-channels that we're looking at. So I think in the past, consumers were keen on opting for e-commerce, but it was still viewed as unreliable in the region, whether it was from a payment aspect or internet penetration, mobile penetration, or even from the logistics aspect. I think what COVID did was kind of push businesses to invest quite rapidly with building that infrastructure, which led to consumers feeling able to resort to option A, which they always wanted, rather than say that consumers gradually shifted because they found that to be more convenient. So I think that was always something that consumers wanted, just didn't have access to. But yes, I do agree. I think the spending that we're seeing on retail infrastructure across the UAE, which is led primarily by government-driven initiatives towards the leading real estate giants, still shows us how ingrained shopping is into the local culture.
I think when it comes to D&I, the culture in the UAE has always been a lot forward thinking and forward moving versus the rest of the region. And I say this with caution, not to just pass a statement on the region overall, but when a lot of people who have not interacted with the region at all think of the UAE, the preconceived notions that sort of interplay their judgment is that perhaps the DNI space in the country is not as mature, perhaps, which has, in my experience at least, especially when we're talking about, because I see there's a question around corporate, and then we can talk about how we instill the same values in the brands as well, at least at corporate level, and at least at the more mature or a multinational corporate level, has always been quite strong. And that has been driven by all ethnicities, whether it's about expat Arabs, the inclusion of the local Emirati women in the government and in key organizations. So it has anyway been quite ahead of let's say the situation around UAE. Whatever I'm putting out there, whatever I'm standing for, whatever it is around my brand or my company that I'm doing, is this culturally all right? Is this not, just to ensure that it's not culturally offensive? And then to also check what the regulation around certain comments, certain lines of communication, certain aspect is.
So diversity, I think there's a beautiful thing happening right now with inclusion is that, and that's the challenge that we have in the region, is bringing in, for example, women of all shapes and sizes. When it comes to women wearing abayas even, it's not simply about women covering up and wearing the shayla. It could be a sporty aspect of that. It could be a plus size woman. It could be so many different things of inclusivity that we still haven't tapped into, but we are open to that. And I think that's the most exciting part. And I think that's where we are at in the UAE right now, is the inclusion in so many different ways. Another thing is, for example, within the food industry, we're seeing a lot of communication that are including men now in the kitchen, not just simply women sitting in the kitchen. So these are very exciting things that the audience in the UAE want to see. So we shouldn't just simply be a reflection of what the culture has been so far. We should actually push it forward. And we have that amazing cultural role within communication, advertising, and our brands. We have the ability to push the envelope. We have the ability to push culture forward within these specific things that are very exciting and coming to life within the UAE and the Middle East as a whole.
Well, I mean, there have been concerns regarding businesses going through greenwashing, but to be quite frank, I think we've seen quite a lot of businesses actually start, initiatives, green initiatives. Mainly, they have to do with eliminating single-use plastics, introducing recycling. The municipalities across the UAE have attempted to drive recycling as well. There are centers, so I think that's one, a couple of small things that we have seen. But generally speaking, sustainability reporting is on the rise. A lot of private businesses were doing it as part of their branding. Other businesses are doing it to save on cost. Especially logistics companies are switching. Some of them are switching from, let's say, diesel to biofuel, and that is actually more efficient for them on a cost perspective as well. But we've also seen that the financial regulator for the financial markets has demanded that companies start producing ESG reports. And as I had highlighted before, certain banks and local funds are introducing ESG into the scorecards. So this is becoming a more relevant topic. I think what sustainability used to be in the region 10 years ago, maybe before 2010, I think it's completely different. Sustainability used to be literally maybe building a rail at one of the shopping centers or cleaning the beach. It's no longer that. It's about more, and the financial regulator has requested that the ESG be integrated directly into the operational and corporate strategies. So you can see the relevance there.
is some way to go at a societal level, although I think that's starting in schools, as it always does. Children are the best influencers, and unless you're the parent, in which case you do have to pay for them for quite a long time. But if you look at government strategy, you've got the world's largest sustainable investor here in the UAE, down in Abu Dhabi, Masdar. You've got the world's largest solar plant. You've got a growing desire to do waste to energy projects. So, you know, we're building waste to energy plants. Obviously, we create a lot of waste, but also, you know, it's an imperative for the UAE to really make sure that sustainability is front and center of all it does, because actually we live in a very harsh environment here. It's a desert. I mean, it's 44 degrees outside. You know, so water is a potential scarcity. So you need to look at things like that. So there's a lot of things that on a daily basis make people think about sustainability and bringing it into their lives. And then of course there's all the, you know, there's the single-use plastic bottle stuff, there's the recycling. We now will have recycling bins outside houses, at least in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. You know, it's definitely growing. We're accelerating. We're not quite Sweden yet, but we're getting there.
When you look at a lot of the researches and when you do home panels, focus groups, and if you ask, at least in my experience, people directly, whether you care about the environment or a more environmentally friendly product, and would you be willing to pay for it, the overwhelming majority would tell you no, and that sort of throws you off a lot of times. But then when you look at the market and the numbers, you will see that a lot of the brands with a very clear sustainability proposition and a lot of times actually charging a premium on that are actually doing quite really well. So whether it's around personal care or food, especially food, you will see that while a lot of consumers might not be willing to accept it or recognize it, they are making choices that are more environmentally friendly.
Another great example of sustainability and the focus on sustainability is really the Expo 2020, which is going to happen now in October. One of the key themes of the Expo is sustainability. And I mean, as we've seen in some of the past Expos, you know, where a site is created and that becomes a ghost town eventually, I think what UAE is particular about is creating a legacy and creating a more sustainable development, which continues, you know, even after the Expo is over. So I think that's another point that underlines the focus of the government on sustainability.